So this is part two of my series on the Garamant civilization. When did they sort of come into existence, as a distinct civilization? Surprisingly, there is no answer. It's kind of a mystery exactly when, Garamants, came into existence. And there's also a mystery about sort of when they, you know, went out of history. There's kind of an argument, did they fully, go out of history? So, anyways, most historians kind of agree that somewhere around 1200, 1100 BCE is, when we can kind of talk about, Garamants existing in northern Africa. Okay. Um, they lived in the Sahara Desert. Okay, so that's essentially, their geographic location, and um, they were traders. Okay, so these things we kind of know for sure. And as soon as I say traders in Sahara, you probably have this image in your mind, that kind of these Berbers in Africa on camels, and this is really surprising, but uh, camels came on the scene much later. Okay, like it wasn't for essentially another 2,000 years that camels began to be used. There was actually kind of a revolution which we haven't heard of, and that's the camel revolution, um, in Africa, and that's when camels replaced horses as the main uh, baggage and transportation method in North Africa. So believe it or not, Garamants and other nomadic tribes, living in Sahara at this time used horses. Okay, and climate was, kind of softer. It wasn't as harsh at that time as it is now. So horses could kind of sort of live in those conditions. Kind of an interesting question. How much grass was there? Like, I mean, did they sort of live in sort of savanna grassland, or was it just dry desert? Hard to say for sure, but climate was a little bit milder back then. Okay, so Garamants were these nomadic, semi-nomadic trades people. I mean, they were intermediaries. So in some ancient sources, mention Carthaginians getting precious stones from Africa. Okay, so where did they get them? Well, they got them from the Garamants. Okay, Garamants were much more skilled than the Carthaginians, at penetrating deep inside Africa. Okay, that's kind of another misconceptions. That Carthaginians, were sort of the greatest explorers of the ancient world. In Herodotus, you read that they kind of possibly circumnavigated Africa, but Garamants got there first. They knew Africa better, like the sort of mysterious parts of it, at least. You can kind of say that Carthaginians were the masters of Africa from the naval point of view, and Garamants were the masters of Africa from the sort of land point of view, if this makes sense. So they were getting good stuff from deeper inside Africa. That's what they did, and here's another thing you probably know, that Roman gladiator fights were very cruel. They slaughtered a lot of animals during those harsh and bloody gladiator games. So the question is, where did they get all these animals for the stage? Well, Garamants got them for the Romans. If you read some sources, I mean, the numbers of animals killed were just outrageous. I mean, some emperors, I mean, had hundreds of animals slaughtered in a single day. Okay, you cannot get so many exotic animals from Europe, and Romans were not getting it themselves. I mean, they were using Garamants to get these animals, and It's kind of crazy to imagine how much work this was and how hard it was. Imagine just capturing wild animals in Africa and you know uh, crossing the Sahara Desert with them, feeding them, supporting them, just to send them to Rome to be killed. I mean, just unbelievable. Um, so that's what essentially Garamantes did as far as their you can say international policy was concerned. Their trade policy. They got goods for the Carthaginians and for the Romans. Okay. Um, what language did they speak? There's actually no agreement, what language they spoke. But it's interesting that they had a writing system called ancient, sort of old Libyan script, but their language has not been deciphered. Okay, so no one really knows what language they spoke, what it sounded like. Um, so linguistically, they are a mystery. Um, they also had incredible technology for their time. They had irrigation systems, essentially these canals which transported water from sort of further areas into their cities, and yeah, it was really a miracle called Fegara. These tunnels which transported water, sort of like Roman aqueducts, but same principle. Essentially, tiny little slope per long distance. So gravity pulls things down. So like if something is inclined, even if it's a tiny little slope, water will roll down. So that's the simple principle, and they used it to transport waters to very far distances. They had tunnels, and they had underground dwellings, and just incredible structures that they built underneath the Sahara Desert. Those tunnels are really ahead of their time. And essentially, they did their own thing until the Romans began to really expand. Okay. Uh, Before this, they just did their thing, like I said, and once the Roman Empire destroyed Carthage, the next logical step for the Romans was to, uh, make a move and try and take over the Garamant land. Okay, so they surprisingly, it was surprisingly difficult, for the Romans, and one of Caesar's good friends, a guy named Balbus, was a general, and he, conquered the Garamant capital city, Garama. It was really, difficult to do, surprisingly. So, those people living in a desert, and, the Romans find it really challenging to, take this city, to take it, to crush the resistance, but they did. However, they did not really, they were not able to hold on to, this conquest, and Garments were pretty much independent. Even after, Balbus, defeated them in the field, and they existed, but after this point, for some reason, they kind of began to slowly decline until uh, Domitian, the Emperor Domitian, essentially worked out a deal with the Garamant king to have a Roman legion stationed in Garama. So that's pretty much the beginning of the end for Garamants. They were occupied by Romans after Domitian's time. Then they try to fight, Byzantines, Vandals. They had a whole bunch of alliances and, treaties with other cities. and cultures, but essentially their story came to an end with the Arab conquest. Okay, so Arabs essentially destroyed, Garama, and that's pretty much all there is to this mysterious civilization. So, did any Garamantes survive? Really arguable question. Historians argue about it, but uh, probably some of them, went kind of southwest and, perhaps mixed with some other, Berber tribes and became Tuaregs. This, tribe, Tuaregs, Berber tribes. So, they have a lot of kind of similar cultural practices. And, it's kind of really interesting that in the Tuareg language, Garama means city, and there are some other kind of linguistic coincidences which sort of suggest that definitely some Garamants became Tuaregs. Were they old Tuaregs, or was it partial mixing, whatever? Hard to say, but some of them did survive, and some of the Garamant DNA, those people still live, which is amazing. So that's pretty much it for this part.